Okay, does anyone know who this is? No one? Yes, exactly. This is Rose. Rose was rescued from an organic, free-range Amazon chicken farm last September by DXE activists as part of a mass rescue. She was found unable to move, with ammonia burns on her body from laying in her own waste. She couldn't access food or water. She would have died. Thankfully, Rose is now safe at a sanctuary. The vast majority of the 9.5 billion land animals who are slaughtered every year in the US for food are chickens just like Rose. Unique individuals who feel pain and happiness, who have personalities and rich inner lives, who are just like us, who want to live and be free. Globally, we kill over 70 billion land animals every year and between 1 to 3 trillion sea animals for food. And while in the US, per capita beef consumption is going down and veganism is on the rise, so is our consumption of chickens. Every year, globally, our demand for the flesh and secretions of other animals increases. And by 2050, it's projected that our consumption of meat is going to increase by over 70%. A world where all individual animals are free from human oppression feels like a very idealistic and unachievable vision. But what if I told you it's not? What if I told you we actually can achieve this vision in our lifetimes? As many of you know, DXE believes that we can achieve animal liberation in 1 generation. Now, when I first heard this, I thought that was ridiculous. I thought this is really idealistic. I just didn't believe it. But I've since changed my mind. And in this talk, I want to share some of the reasons why I believe this is achievable, and more importantly, how we can achieve this in our lifetimes. And the key lies in the social justice movements of the past. But before I say any more, I would like to ask you 2 questions, and to do this in pairs. First, what are some of the well-known progressive societal changes that have happened in the last 200 years? And secondly, what do these changes have in common about how they came about? So I'll give you 3 minutes to talk about this. Go. Okay, thank you so much. So here are some of the well-known progressive societal changes that I picked out, and they all have something in common. The abolition of slavery in the US and the UK, Indian independence, women winning the right to vote, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Serbian dictator Milosevic being overthrown by the student movement Otpor in the early 2000s as part of the Colour Revolution, and the Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak being overthrown during the Egyptian Revolution, which happened as part of the Arab Spring in 2011. So what do they all have in common? No, it was rhetorical. All of these changes were driven by mass movements that had the power to demand structural change. And all of these movements built their power through protest, through disruption, and through mass civil disobedience. Now, we don't really learn much about mass protest movements and their role in social change at school, at least I certainly didn't. And we don't really hear much about mass movements on the mass media, which is so focused on electoral politics. But As civil rights veteran and historian Howard Zinn wrote, "The good things that have been done, the wars that have been stopped, the women's rights that have been won, the racism that has been partly extirpated in society, all of that was not done by government edict. It was all done by citizens' movements. When a movement is strong enough, it doesn't matter who is in the White House. What really matters is what people do, and what people say, and what people demand." There is a whole field of study of civil resistance and nonviolent conflict which examines how unarmed movements fight injustice when it seems like their opponents hold all the power. And despite the fact that I have spent my entire career in social change in the field of international development, I didn't really understand the importance of mass movements in social change until very recently when I read this amazing book called This Is an Uprising. And it's so inspiring, and I'm basing my talk on this book today. I would recommend everybody read it. And then in November last year, I had the opportunity to experience the power of mass civil disobedience when I had the opportunity to volunteer for Extinction Rebellion. And I, amongst other very strange things, helped to plan and coordinate the occupation of Lambeth Bridge. And for those of you, how many here actually know who Extinction Rebellion are? Okay, that's great. For those of you who don't know, Extinction Rebellion is a climate direct action group that's based in the UK that came to prominence last November and has grown exponentially over the last 7 months and has now got over 200 groups globally. And you may have heard about their international rebellion in April, just recently, where they mobilized over 6,000 people and brought mass disruption to London over the course of 10 days, and over 1,000 people got arrested. Now, it seems from the outside that Extinction Rebellion has just come out of nowhere, but of course it hasn't. And one of the reasons that it has been able to grow exponentially is, well, it's partly because it is drawing from the same strategies and concepts and principles from the field of civil resistance, including a particular organizing model called momentum-driven organizing, which I am going to talk to you about now. And the three big ideas that I want to talk about are the power of people, the power of momentum, and the power of strategy. So, the power of people. One of the core principles underlying mass protest movements is their theory of where power lies in society, their theory of power. Now, we're conditioned to believe that power lies in the political system, and social change happens because of the actions of politicians and our so-called leaders. And we traditionally think that power flows from top to bottom, and that social change, comes from politicians and lobbyists and lawyers and donors working behind the scenes. But successful social movements have succeeded precisely because ordinary people have come together and changed public opinion and forced these politicians to address issues that they would rather have avoided. So this tells us that power actually lies with the people, and we give it away through our consent and through our cooperation and through our obedience. Well, then this also tells us we can take our power back by withdrawing our consent and our cooperation and our obedience. But most of us don't feel like we have the power to actually change anything in society. And this is why civil resistance campaigns are so important, because they help us to experience our power and help us understand that we actually do have power if we act collectively. And I heard recently that Gandhi spent a year going around India doing a sort of needs assessment and realized that people just weren't ready to build a mass movement because they didn't feel empowered. And he knew that they needed to experience winning in order to actually realize their power. So he focused on local, winnable, small campaigns to help people to experience their power. And this is what they did, and they were able to build a mass movement because they felt empowered. And actually, DXC do something quite similar with their protests and disruptions. These protests and disruptions are just as much about creating a strong network and community of empowered activists as it is about disrupting the social norm of eating animals in society. So, our theory of where power lies in society is directly of how change happens in society, our theory of change. If we believe that people at the top of society, our so-called leaders, have all the power, then we will focus on pressuring those leaders. And we can do that in different ways. We can do that by changing the system from the inside, through party politics or lobbying, the so-called inside game. Or we can do this from outside the system by building strong organizations like NGOs and trade unions and developing campaigns targeted to pressure those leaders from outside the system, the so-called outside game. Both the inside game and the outside game tend to only maintain or reform the status quo. But if we believe that power lies with the people, then we would build strong social movements that can actually pressure society to change from outside and force social change. And, this is, unlike the inside game and the outside game, this is about disrupting and transforming the status quo. Now, this is the theory of change that underlies successful social justice movements, and this is the theory of change that I believe holds the key to success in the animal liberation movement. But I should say that even though, there are lots of different theories of change, and they are all valid and they are all important. And Bill Moyer, a civil rights activist and social movement theorist, looked at a range of successful social justice movements, and he found that there were 4 main roles of social activism that happened throughout those movements by individuals and groups. And they all have a role to play, and they all each of them come to the fore at different stages of the movement cycle. So if we're talking about the rebel, the direct action activist that's trying to change the game, often they would come to the fore at the takeoff stage of the movement cycle. And then if we're talking about the reformer, the professional NGO that's working to change the system from inside and perhaps transform the winds of the rebels and turn it into laws, they often came to the fore at later stages of the movement cycle. So most of us, myself included, feel that our role and our way is the right way, but actually all of these roles are needed. And this theory about people power is supported by some excellent research by Chenoweth and Stevens in their book, Why Civil Resistance Works. And they analysed over 300 national-level struggles over the last century and found that no campaign failed once it had achieved the active and sustained participation of 3.5% of the population, and many succeeded with much less. Now, 3.5% of the population in the US is about 11.5 million people. And active participation means anything from voting, petitioning, donating, and non-cooperating. There's a whole range of things. They also found that non-violent movements were twice as likely to succeed as violent movements. And this is because non-violent movements have the ability to draw in many more people than violent movements, because violence scares people off. So this whole idea of the power of people can be summarized in this quote by Bill Moyer. And he wrote, "The central task of social movements is to win the hearts, minds, and support of the majority of the populace, because it is the people who ultimately hold the power. They will either preserve the status quo or create change." Okay, so we've talked about the power of people. But how are we meant to get the sustained and active participation of 11.5 million people when there are only around, I believe, 1.6 million vegans in the US, and only a small percentage of them actually take direct action? So what does the history of social justice movements have to teach us about how to actually build a movement? Well, the first thing to say is that movements are built one campaign at a time. And there is a concept of momentum, which seems to be very key in winning campaigns and ultimately building mass movements. And the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins of 1960, during part of the civil rights movement, is a classic example of a campaign that was able to create momentum through direct action, to build that momentum and absorb it to create a mass movement and ultimately win their demand. So I'm going to share the story of the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins for those of you who don't know it. But before I do, I want to say how strange it feels to be talking about this, because yesterday, I don't know if any of you were in any of the nonviolence trainings, but Bernard Lafayette was actually, he was part of this movement. He was a leader in the Nashville student movement and went on to become a leader in the civil rights movement. So it feels very strange to be actually talking about this when we spent the day with him yesterday, and that was such a privilege. Okay, so as most of you probably know, during this time in the American South, businesses and private institutions were segregated. Black people were prevented from voting, and lynchings were a common occurrence. And in 1959, a man called James Lawson, who had been studying Gandhian nonviolence in India, came to Nashville, Tennessee, and he put on a series of workshops on strategic nonviolence or nonviolent resistance for local divinity students over the course of about 6 months. And he trained them in the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence, but he also taught them, through role play, how to embody nonviolence so that they could maintain nonviolent discipline when they were out to protest. So the students and Jim Lawson analysed the situation in Nashville to try and come up with a campaign idea. And they decided to focus on a small target that they could win. So they decided to focus on desegregating the lunch counters. Now, they thought that this was symbolic of their oppression. They didn't think that winning this would end segregation or end racism, but what they hoped was that if they could win this campaign, it would inspire others to join them so that they could build their power to ultimately demand, the ultimate change. So they planned their campaign, and part of their strategy was going to the lunch counters, ordering food, sitting down to eat that food at the lunch counter, which was not allowed, and then refusing to leave for the rest of the day. And in the meantime, 4 students from Greensboro, North Carolina, who had had the same idea. I understand from Bernard Lafayette the idea was actually floating around, because I couldn't work out why, how this idea was, in one place, another place, but it was something that was quite commonly talked about. So they actually went off and did it. The Greensboro 4, you may have heard of them. So this spurred the Nashville students on, and 12 days later, a group of black students went to 3 different lunch counters, ordered food, sat down, and refused to leave. The shop owners didn't know what to do, so they closed the shops. And the students celebrated, they felt empowered, but they also realized this was just the beginning. And they knew that they had to come back week after week until their demand was met. So, they went back week after week, and after about 3 weeks, they had inspired enough people to join them that they could go to 6 lunch counters. This time, they were met with violence and arrest. And shocking pictures went into the papers. And, when they were arrested, they would refuse bail and they would go on hunger strike. And when they were let out of jail, they would go straight back out and protest again. Their perseverance, their sacrifice, their belief inspired people. It convinced people who weren't really convinced by their disruption. And the movement just took off. so many people wanted to join in, but they didn't necessarily want to face violence on the lunch counters. But the students were ready. They had a plan in place, and they had roles and tasks for people to do, demonstrating outside the police station, leafleting, fundraising. And then they called for a boycott of the downtown area, something that everybody could participate in. And I think over 90% of the black population participated in this boycott, and this turned it into a mass movement. And it's really important to note that if they had started off by calling for a boycott, it wouldn't have been successful. The reason it was successful is because they escalated their actions strategically. Okay, so at the same time, counter-protests started happening, and they were incredibly racist. And people just didn't want to be part of it. So this again increased the support for the students and for desegregation of the lunch counters. And then the attorney who was defending the students had his house bombed. And luckily he survived. Oh, well, he wasn't home, I don't think. But the thing is that this caused mass outrage. And the students, again, were ready to capitalize on this outrage. And they organized a mass march to City Hall to confront the mayor. And Diane Nash, one of the student leaders, confronted the mayor and asked him publicly what he thought of segregated lunch counters. And either because he was backed into a corner or because he could feel that things were changing, he said he didn't agree with them. And that was an amazing victory for them. And within 3 months, I think, all the lunch counters in Nashville were desegregated. So this campaign inspired the civil rights movement, and it provided a model for future civil rights campaigns. And the leaders of the Nashville movement, like Bernard Lafayette, became leaders in the civil rights movement. Now, there are so many interesting things about this story that I could tell you. I'm going to try and draw out just a few concepts to help us understand how we can translate the strategies of this campaign to help us in our animal liberation work. And the first concept that I want to talk about is something called escalation. Now, social movements need to force the public to actually take notice of their issue and to take a stance. And escalating non-violent direct action does this. It forces the issue out into the public, and it makes people take a stance by asking them, which side are you on? And this is a great quote from Diane Nash, one of the leaders of the Nashville movement. And it illustrates the choice that this campaign and the students presented to people. It was either kill us or desegregate, which isn't much of a choice, and that is the point. The campaign wasn't about persuading people one by one. It was about forcing societal change through escalating direct action and making people take a stance. And Martin Luther King had this nice quote about a nonviolent direct action, and he said, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." And there are so many ways to take escalating nonviolent direct action. Gene Sharp documented 198 ways, all the way from petitioning, leafleting, mock funerals, vigils, all the way to occupations, strikes, boycotts. Okay, so the next concept is this idea of a trigger event and something called a moment of the whirlwind. Bill Moyer says that trigger events are really key to social movements because they provide activists with a vital opportunity to rally mass support and really quickly increase public support and participation. And we can either respond to external trigger events, I don't know, for example, the IPCC report or declaration of war, or we can create our own trigger events through escalating nonviolent direct action. And if you have multiple trigger events, you can create, well, this is the ideal, something called a moment of the whirlwind. And a moment of the whirlwind is a moment where masses of people start taking independent action, but linked to your central movement and your central demands. Now, the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins are referred to as a trigger event, and they escalated, and it did become a moment of the whirlwind because they were able to make it into a mass movement. Other examples of trigger events are Rosa Parks refusing to move to the back of the bus, which sparked a community-wide boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. Another example is the Tunisian fruit seller, Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire, and that sparked the Arab Spring. Okay. The Nashville sit-ins were designed to be something called a dilemma action. Now, dilemma actions are designed to put your opponent into a dilemma about how to respond to you. They can either let you get away with it, or they can respond with violence and arrest and repression, which looks over the top and ultimately ends up inspiring sympathy for your cause. And that is what happened in Nashville. And a really good example of a dilemma action in the animal liberation movement is open rescue. And, Open Rescue was first started by Patty Mark and Animal Liberation Victoria in the 1980s, but it's now practiced all over the world and is a key tactic of DXE. And for those of you who don't know, open rescues are when activists go onto farms and they document the conditions and they rescue animals. And it's called open because activists don't hide their identities the way they do when they're doing undercover investigations. And these open rescues often get a lot of media attention. So then the industry is put into a dilemma. They can either allow the activists to get away with this exposure, or they can repress with, by charging them with trespass or burglary, and basically threatening activists who are just rescuing sick and dying animals with prison, which seems totally over the top and then ultimately would inspire sympathy. So they're put into a lose-lose situation. So this is really key to think about when we're thinking about our actions. Okay, so the next concept is this idea of disruption. The lunch counter sit-ins were very disruptive. They breached the social norms of the day. Now, many black people disagreed with the action, saying things like, "This makes our race look bad." Does this sound familiar to anybody here? How many of us have heard people say about animal rights activists doing disruptive actions that this makes vegans look bad? Right, I think pretty much everyone. I think I've said it myself, let alone heard it. So, okay, so this is a really interesting slide which shows that the majority of the public were against later disruptive campaigns in the civil rights movement, like the Freedom Rides, and yet they still brought people around to their cause. Disruptive direct action has been used in many successful social justice movements for good reason, because disruption gets people's attention. It dramatizes the injustice, it mobilizes people to action, and ultimately it does change public opinion. So disruption, which is a key, is key to DXE's theory of change, is there for a very good reason. And Martin Luther King wrote this when he was responding to criticism of disruptive action which had resulted in violence in Birmingham. He wrote, "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of the tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with." Okay. So the next concept is this idea of personal sacrifice. The activists in Nashville were willing to make huge personal sacrifices for the cause. And, sacrifice touches people's hearts. It demonstrates seriousness and commitment, and it moves people from being passive supporters to actively taking a stand. So sacrifice has been an essential part of social justice movements and mass civil disobedience over the years. Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, over 60,000 people were arrested. In later civil rights campaigns, they had the slogan, "Jail, no bail." And mass arrest is a key part of Extinction Rebellion strategy. Okay, so the next concept is a concept called nonviolent discipline. The Nashville students maintained nonviolent discipline throughout their protests, even when they were being beaten up and arrested. And this had the impact of showing people the contrast between them and the violent people who were beating them up. And again, asking people, whose side do you want to be on? Okay. And the final concept is something called absorption, which is not something we really talk about, but is actually key to building movements and building power. So once the students had started to get public support, they had this plan in place to actually absorb the energy and the momentum that they had created. Now, often we see mass protest movements, come up really quickly and then disappear again just as quickly if they don't have the structures in place to absorb the momentum and the energy that they create. And you can have the best campaign in the world, but if you don't have the structures to be able to absorb, this energy, then you're not going to be able to build power and build your movement and to win your campaigns. There's lots of different ways to to absorb this momentum that you create. But one of the key things that if you don't have a decentralized organizational structure, it's going to be very difficult to actually grow exponentially. Okay. So I know that's quite a lot of concepts, and I don't expect you all to remember them. I think that they can be summarized in something called the cycle of momentum, which is the basic underlying mechanism of what I talked about, this model of organizing, momentum-driven organizing that Extinction Rebellion is using, and that so many of these social justice movements have actually used. And so we start off with escalating nonviolent direct action, and then you absorb the momentum that you create, and this leads to increased active popular support. And if you remember, we're talking about this 3.5%, that's what we want, active popular support. And then we just keep going, through this cycle. And one of the key points is that we don't grow linearly. It's cyclical. So Extinction Rebellion is using this model really successfully. So they have escalated through mass civil disobedience and through mass arrests. They have been able to absorb a lot of this energy because they have a decentralized structure, and they do mass trainings. And this is a really good mechanism of absorbing energy and absorbing that momentum and getting people actually engaged in your movement and getting increasingly involved. So these mass trainings, they will train 100 people at a time in nonviolent direct action. And one of the key things in this training is actually to help you to form affinity groups with people that you don't know, but who may be living in your local area, giving you all the tools that you need to then go off and start doing autonomous actions aligned with the movement. But that's it. You go to the training, you're helped to find a group, and then go off and start doing your actions. And then this increases active popular support, and it starts all over again. Okay, so we've talked about the power of people, the power of momentum, and the last thing I want to talk about is the power of strategy. Groups can carry out tactics very successfully, but if they are not serving a campaign demand or a wider strategy, we are not going to be able to build the power that we need to win. To build a mass movement, we need a bold and inspirational vision of change and a roadmap for getting there. And one of the ways that we can build this roadmap or build a sort of simple strategy is this tool, which you can plan from top to bottom. So we can think about what is our grand strategic objective, what is our grand demand. And for us, it would be, maybe some kind of constitutional amendment or some legislation that changes the paradigm from property to personhood for other animals. And then we can think about what are the milestones or the medium-term phases to actually achieve that grand demand. And then we can go one stage lower and think about what are the campaigns that we can do that can help us to achieve those milestones. And then at the bottom level, we can think about what are the tactics and methods that will help us to achieve those campaign demands. Okay, so if we think about the civil rights movement, I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm sure they didn't strategize like this, even though they did strategize very heavily. But their grand strategic objective could be something like equality for people of colour, which still has not been achieved. Their milestones could have been desegregation and equal voting rights. Their campaigns for desegregation could have been the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins, the Birmingham campaign, the Mississippi Freedom Summer. For equal voting rights, one of the campaign could have been the Selma campaign, and then their tactics for things like the lunch counter sit-ins, marches, boycotts, mass arrests. Okay, so another thing to note is that we really need to make clear demands when we're doing our campaigns. Martin Luther King found this out in Albany, where the campaign was about ending segregation and all forms of segregation, and it didn't achieve anything and he put this down to the fact that it was too vague. And he wrote, "The mistake I made there was to protest against segregation generally rather than against a single and distinct facet of it. Our protest was so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left very depressed and in despair." And this holds a really important lesson for us in the animal liberation movement. And I'm going to come back to this towards the end of my talk about lessons from all of this for us. So again, this idea of clear demands, when we think about Extinction Rebellion, they're rebelling against extinction, and presumably they want they probably want sort of transformation of the whole system, but they're not mobilizing around that big demand. They've got three very clear, very simple demands. One of which is to ask governments to tell the truth, rather demand that government tells the truth, and declares a climate emergency. And off the back of the April protests, the UK Parliament, not the government, but the Parliament, have declared a climate and ecological emergency. So they haven't achieved their demand, but there's some progress towards a particular demand. So this is a really important thing for us to sort of make something, make it a norm within our movements to actually think about the demands, the simple demands that we have. Now, a really important concept to help us think about how to choose demands that will actually mobilize people is this idea of symbolic demands. Now, symbolic demands are designed to polarize people, and polarization means casting issues in terms of right and wrong. So again, it's sort of helping or asking people to pick a side. And like I said before, the Nashville lunch counter sit-in campaign, the segregated lunch counters were symbolic of their oppression. They knew it wasn't going to end segregation, but it was a symbol of their oppression, so they went after that. And a really classic example of a symbolic demand and a symbolic campaign was the Dundee Salt March. He didn't mobilize people around kicking the British out of India. He mobilized people around the injustice of the British monopoly on salt, which, to me it seems kind of random, but it's something that people, almost everybody felt, because it affected everybody. And it was through this that he was able to build a mass movement. Okay, so we've talked about the power of people, the power of momentum, and the power of strategy. What does all of this have to do with animal liberation? How can we use these ideas and concepts to win? It's so difficult because it's like these concepts and strategies are very complex, or rather they're difficult to actually apply to the animal liberation movement. But I have distilled 10 lessons, which I think can provide a starting point for us, some food for thought as we move forward. And this is actually part of the work that Animal Think Tank, the collective that I'm part of, is committed to do. How do the lessons of past social justice movements apply to our movement, and how can we use them to win animal liberation? So, if we want to reach this 3.5% of the population, then we are going to have to mobilize people who are not vegan yet. And this might sound counterintuitive to people and maybe even hypocritical. I mean, for a long time this sounded hypocritical to me, but we need to mobilize anyone and everyone who can be moved to act. And it seems that there are actually a lot of people who could be moved to act, because people do care about animals. Maybe not in the way that we want them to yet, maybe not in the way that we think that they should yet, but they do. The Sentience Institute did a study a couple of years ago, which found that 47% of people in the US think that slaughterhouses should be banned. Now, even if that was a massive overestimation, that's still a heck of a lot of people that could be moved to act. In the US, apparently nearly a third of people believe that other animals should have the same rights as humans. 50% of people apparently believe that animal testing should be banned. So that's a lot of people who care about animals, and there's probably a lot of power in these people joining anti-speciesist campaigns and being transformed by the experience of being part of that. So I think this is a really important thing for us to hold on to. And building a broad-based movement is important not just for strategic reasons, it's important for issues of justice as well, because we need to have movements which are safe for marginalized groups. Okay, I've just been given a 10-minute warning, so I might hurry up a little bit. The second lesson is this idea of nonviolence. And, many of us spent the whole day yesterday thinking about and talking about nonviolence from both a philosophical and a strategic perspective. We know that nonviolent movements are twice as likely to succeed as violent movements. So whatever we feel about the philosophy and the morality of nonviolence, from a strategic perspective, nonviolence is really important, and that's one of the reasons it's a key value of DXC. So I focused a lot on the role of the rebel, the direct action activist, but there are at least three other roles in the movement. And, they are all needed. So there's a place for everybody. We all have unique contributions to make. And so I think we need to just be okay with the fact that there are going to be other people doing things that we don't necessarily feel that they should be doing or that we would want to do. It's okay. The movement needs all of us. Okay. Now, disruption. Now, this is pretty controversial in the vegan movement, and maybe not in this room, hopefully not in this room, but out there it is. When I first saw DXC activists going into shops and restaurants and shouting, "It's not food, it's violence," and I was like, what are they doing? This is making us look ridiculous. But then I learned what I've just shared with you about the power of disruption. If we want to grow the movement exponentially, if we want to force the injustice of our use of other animals into the public consciousness, we need to embrace the power of disruption, and we need to embrace our own power to disrupt. Okay, so sacrifice. All successful social movements have involved activists being willing to lay their bodies on the line for the cause. And, there's quite a few DXC activists who are facing many, many years in jail for doing things like open rescue and investigations. And this is quite a complex issue, because if we're talking about jail and arrest, there's also issues to do with power and privilege, which doesn't make it a straightforward request of people, regardless of all the other issues. But if there are people who have certain privileges and who want to use those in a strategic way for the cause, then we're going to have to become okay with jail, lose our fear around jail and arrest, because ultimately it is fear that holds these systems of violence in place. Okay, so I think most of us here might probably have got the memo that one-off protests don't work. We need sustained campaigns. And the Nashville campaign was a sustained campaign. They were at it day in, day out until they won their demand. Okay, so The dominant form of activism in the movement at the moment is asking people to go vegan one by one. Now, this is really important. It's creating change on an individual level, it's creating change on a cultural level. But it's not going to build the power that we need to create structural change. These past social justice movements have shown us that we need collective action to actually make this structural change. The legislative. So, to me, this means we need to build a powerful anti-speciesist mass movement that has the power to demand structural change. And it also, it also means to me that we need to remember that we are allies in this movement. It's the animals movement, and we have to recognize them as the actors in their own liberation. Okay. 8, roadmap for change. So right now we're either kind of focused on the big demand of go vegan or on individual tactics like vigils, cubes of truth, vegan outreach. And if we want to win, we need to develop a long-term strategic vision of how we're actually going to create this change. And that is super important. Now, just like the Nashville students didn't campaign to end segregation, we can't really start off by asking for or demanding the end of all animal oppression. We don't have the power to do that yet. But if we build campaigns and build our power, one day we will have the power to demand that legislative change. Okay, and the final lesson is we need to stay humble. We need to keep learning and keep reflecting, because none of us has a monopoly on the truth, and all of our perspectives are partial. And this slogan from the movement From a New Society, I like, and it says, most of what we need to know, we have yet to learn. If anything that I have said in the last 45 minutes has resonated with you, and you want to learn more, then the first thing I would suggest is to read This Is an Uprising. It is a brilliant book. And it really will inspire you to believe that we can do this in our lifetimes. And if you want to go even deeper, there is an amazing institute, the Momentum Institute, which has got a series of 8 webinars on actually, how to build mass movements using the momentum-driven organizing structure. But it's not enough to actually just keep acquiring knowledge, we have to put it into action. So I would encourage everyone to commit fully to participating in the DXE actions on Monday and Tuesday, because I hear they are transformative, and who's not ready for transformation? And secondly, commit to going back home and finding groups that resonate with you and taking action regularly. And it could be whatever it is that you feel resonates with you. It doesn't have to be disruptive direct action. Remember, the movement needs us all. I have 3 minutes for question and answers. I didn't realize I was going to go on for so long. So if anybody has any, before my last slide, if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Yes.
I can talk about it. So one thing that is really curious to me is getting involved more in my career aspects, in what you're doing. Can you talk about that, or give us information we can go to?
In terms of being the movement, building social movements as part of your career.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, because this is, I haven't found a career in building social movements. It's something that I have had to organize my life around. But in terms of more information to do with actually learning more about this, there's the center, was it ICNC, the Institute or something for Nonviolence. There's lots of little groups in universities, there's a group at Rutgers that studies a lot into non-violence, and I can come and talk to you at the end, because I don't know if I fully understood your question, but there's lots of resources.
I thought you worked for the animal thing. Do you work for that?
Yes, okay, so that's the volunteer grassroots organization, yes. We're all volunteers, we're not funded. It's not exactly a career path. But no, but this is a really important point. It's very difficult, once these grassroots organisations professionalise and rely on donors, money. they end up not being so radical anymore. So I think there's a tension there, which I think many of us are trying to work out.
All right, one last quick question right here.
Oh, but okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, go for it.
Again, I'll try to make this quick.
Yeah.
How do you respond to the kind of a challenge in the analogy between previous social justice movements? The main difference, or one important difference, is that the victims of oppression in all of these movements that we've outlined themselves take active participation in the pushback, whereas in our movement, we are acting on behalf of, and I'm wondering, what's your response to that challenge?
Yes, thank you. That is a really good question, and it's something I ponder all the time, and we talk about it all the time because it's a really difficult thing. So one thing I would say is that, yes, that's absolutely right, but there are other examples of ally movements, the abolition of slavery, the child's rights movements, and there must be huge lessons to learn from there. But secondly, I don't know what the alternative is. I really don't. If you can give me an alternative to building a mass movement, then I will do that. But right now, I don't see that there is. I'm just going to go to my last slide because it's a nice one and I don't want to end on this note. So, society has conditioned us to believe that we do not have the power to change anything. But the history of civil resistance movements shows us that we do. But we have to believe that social change is possible. And Andrea Davis said it beautifully, and she said, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. If every single one of us here right now commits to standing in true solidarity with other animals, if we commit to stepping into our power, to taking action, and to demanding change, we will achieve animal liberation in one generation. Thank you.